Alright, so we were talking about these three levels of familiarity for your target audience. Very familiar, semi-familiar, and mostly unfamiliar. So now I'll try to make it a little more concrete, although again it is very subjective and it will differ even amongst those of you watching this video because you're from different countries and the context differs from one country to the next, from one language group to the next. If we go back to our good old Kiswahili book here, I am going to just assume that these pictures will be mostly familiar in the Kenyan context because that's what it was specifically created for, and I'm sure that the illustrators were intentional about making it familiar. So again, some of you could argue for particular regions of Kenya, maybe these would be completely foreign concepts. There's always room for argument, but we want to not stretch it too far and say, well, okay, this is basically how children dress and what their rooms may look like, or at least not be completely unfamiliar for sure. You know, a typical market scene, or you know, what people look like, what the towns look like, what schools look like. So I would guess this would probably be classified under very familiar in most circumstances. If we look at our wind and sun, there's not really a whole lot going on here, and again we're looking particularly at the illustrations in this. If you do read the language, you know, you can also base your judgment on what you gather from the storyline itself. Here, if anything, we do have the character is of African descent, so that's not terribly unusual. Perhaps in some cultures men don't walk around in shorts, but other than that, you know, everywhere on the earth there is wind and there is sun and there are people. So this would probably, I think, fit under very familiar. There's nothing really that's going to throw a small child off from understanding that content, in my judgment. Again, for our foods and bodies, from one region of Africa to another, you're going to not necessarily find all of these foods, but certainly compared to Europe or the United States, this is more typically African. Again, you know, some people might eat more corn or more cassava or more rice or whatever in other regions, but a lot of this is probably going to be familiar. So on this particular book, I would defer to your particular region, whether you would classify that as very familiar, if these are very common foods that the child will be exposed to, or perhaps semi-familiar if it's not common at all in their region, but it would be overall in the country overall. And you can certainly see we have attempted in this particular book to show that it is a general African context. So this would probably be either very familiar or semi-familiar depending on your region. Now I'm going to show you a book which was actually adapted from India, which should be very apparent as soon as you start seeing the illustrations. These are not really African children. They're dressed a little funny, perhaps for, you know, for the African context, but maybe not that differently from some African contexts. If you look inside their houses, you know, some things may be kind of similar, some things may be kind of different. In this story, the child is getting up and getting ready and bathing and going to school, which would probably be familiar even though the illustrations, you know, the exact way the house is and the way the people look and how they're dressed are maybe not exactly the same as what the child is exposed to, but perhaps not completely unfamiliar either. So you would think, well, the child would still have certain familiar things in the story and in the environment that they would be able to recognize and easily understand the story. So I would guess this might be a candidate for semi-familiar.